to get right to it, I'll start with charcoal and the fact that it's a main driver of deforestation in Africa. Starting with Jillene, how did we get there?
Well, I think we're here because the world collectively has failed to prioritize and invest in one of the most critical levers we have to address the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity, and nature loss, and that's clean cooking. Around the world, 2.4 billion people have no access to clean cooking solutions and instead rely on traditional, harmful, and polluting fuels to cook their daily meals. And this comes at an enormous cost to both the economy, that's estimated $2.4 trillion of loss each year in local economic loss, climate and environmental impacts, to human health, more than 3 million premature deaths each year from indoor air pollution, predominantly women and children, and massive land destruction in terms of forest degradation. 34% of all biomass harvested for household fuel use is done so unsustainably, and it's done so in precious biodiversity hotspots and carbon sinks around the world. We look at DRC, for example, which is home to one of the most precious and incredible forests and carbon sinks and biodiversity hotspots with 10,000 species that provide the equivalent of 10 years of carbon services to the planet. 90% of the population in the Democratic Republic of Congo relies on charcoal for cooking, and they are losing 1 million acres of forest each year just due to household fuel collection. At this rate, 30% of the forest will be gone by 2030 and completely razed by 2100. And that is a service that not only provides clean air, water, biodiversity to the Congo Basin, to the continent of Africa, but to the entire planet. And so we really need to think about what cooking plays in the global climate development and ecosystem services and get serious about how we can make a difference in something that seems very small and somewhat niche and is not often as exciting or as sexy as large-scale infrastructure projects or some of the other decarbonization work that we are discussing this week. But it is something that adds up. 2.4 billion people every meal, every day.
And Jillene, you've given us an idea of the scale of the damage. Taking it to Susan, what's being done to conserve forests, to protect them, and to restore them?
Maybe just to add a little bit on the point that you've just raised, absolutely spot on, and especially in countries like DRC. But also to mention that charcoal production, wood fuel energy, is also a big source of livelihood and income for a significant majority of people who don't have other alternative sources of livelihood. So even as we are thinking about transitioning to clean cooking, we have to think that we are going to displace a huge number of people who are working in that sector. Actually, when I started doing my master's thesis, I did study about the production of charcoal in Tanzania and looking at whether there are sustainable ways of producing it. And of course, on the economy side, there could be ways of producing charcoal, but on the health side, it is very, very difficult to justify continuation of using these sources of energy, and especially with the significant negative impacts that we are seeing on rural women. More than 90% of them who are now suffering from respiratory-related kind of illnesses as a result of huge exposure from wood, smoke, and other sources of unclean energy. So what is being done? There's a lot of work that is being done. First of all, I must say we are looking at more treating the symptoms as opposed to looking at the underlying, causes of where we are. So for the treating of symptoms, what we are doing a lot is to look at landscape restoration, of course, areas that have been degraded. And Africa is one of the continents with one of the biggest landscape restoration programs on the across the world. We have the AFR 100, that's the Africa Forest Restoration Initiative, which has an ambition to restore at least 100 million hectares by 2030. We are seeing huge national commitments. We are seeing a lot of local level activities by civil society organizations, farmer groups that are trying to restore areas that have been degraded. But as I say, when we try to restore, but not looking at what is driving deforestation and addressing clean cooking sources, providing alternative sources of livelihoods, you're planting trees on one hand and they are being cut on the other hand. So I think we need those kind of systemic integrated interventions, both in terms of restoring what has been degraded, as well as providing alternative clean cooking energy sources and alternative sources of livelihood for people who will be displaced from that sector.
And speaking of alternatives, Sophie, at KOKO, you've managed to actually convert charcoal users to cleaner sources of cooking. Can you speak to that experience?
Okay, thank you so much. So at KOKO Networks, we have managed to bring together technology, infrastructure, policy together to provide fuel utility. And what we are using, the fuel we are using is bioethanol. So we've managed to bring this affordably to people who otherwise have only the option of charcoal or firewood. So it's literally the people who have no other alternative and have no way of getting access to clean cooking. We launched this. We retail a 2-burner cooker, and the bioethanol is dispensed using ATMs. So rather than bottling and putting more plastic out there, our focus is on making sure that a household, they can actually buy the bioethanol. So we use a reusable canister. And underpinning this is technology. So technology is along the whole value chain. And then we ensure that the ATMs are literally where these people live, because we need to adapt to how they buy and how they cook. So it's literally a stone's throw away from where they live. So we handle the downstream. Upstream, what we have done is we decided not to reinvent the wheel. Fossil fuel liquid companies have the infrastructure to transport liquid fuel. So we have converted pre-existing systems, and that is what we use to transport the bioethanol and get it as close as we can to the consumers. We have done this very successfully in Kenya. Currently, we are at 700,000 households in just slightly over 3 years, which is amazing. But the reason we're so successful is because of carbon. Yeah, if you think about our business model, needs carbon credits. We sell carbon credits, which enable us to make the solution affordable. A 2-burner cooker, together with the canister, currently retails at $15. If you think about it, the whole kit, together with, we give 2 free refills, would retail at $100. But carbon enables us to be able to get it affordably to the people that need it most. More importantly is we have signed an investment agreement with Rwanda for us to launch there next year. And we're appealing to governments in all the other countries where deforestation is the leading charcoal due to deforestation and the challenges that come with it. We are appealing to them. Do engage with us. We are open and we're willing to have the conversations about what it will take for us to come and scale in their country. Thank you.
What's interesting about your model is quite radical in terms that you've gone all the way to provide a biofuel accessible with your KOKO points and distribution networks. How do you feel about people who say that, and there's a lot of push that's been done to use liquefied natural gas, which is less polluting than charcoal, but probably more polluting than ethanol. What do you feel about the use of LPG as a way to the transition?
Okay. First of all, I'll say 2030 is not that far off. And I think we've repeatedly said this. The Earth is not waiting for us. We need everyone to come on board. So for us, we are playing in that sector, the people who are absolutely underserved, who cannot see a pathway to a clean and renewable fuel. So LPG has its place. Jillene talked about 2.6 billion people. It doesn't make sense for us to try and say, I'm here first, I need to have right of way. Everybody has an opportunity to provide a clean solution So why don't we all go out there and see what we can do to bring on board as many of these people who currently do not have the option? And I've repeatedly said this, it doesn't help for someone to have food, and there's no way for them to convert that raw food into something that they can eat. We need to pull our hands together and make sure that at the end of the day, they have a hot meal. They have something that a mother can feed her children, can feed, and we can feed the community, and we can make sure that everybody has something that is nutritional. Thank you.
Jillene, would you like to add to that about the solutions that you're seeing?
No, absolutely. I mean, I echo Sophie. I think we as the Clean Cooking Alliance, we really do work across the entire clean cooking value chain and all of the viable fuels and technologies that are available, because they are very context specific. And we are trying to reach billions of people in countries across Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, where the context and the local resources and the circumstances and the livelihoods are all very different. So being able to develop innovative business models and utilize technologies and resources that are available that meet the needs of people where they are today and provide affordable, accessible choice. This is not necessarily about some benevolent donor deciding that, you know, this is a wonderful cook stove, we want to give it to you in your home, in your village, and tick the box of access to clean cooking. This is about developing sustainable markets and solutions and providing people with fuels and technologies that they can afford, that they want, that meet their needs, that work within their lifestyles. And in many markets, ethanol is a phenomenal technology, and companies like KOKO are delivering resources to communities at a pace and a scale that is really, truly commendable. But in other cases, particularly in agricultural areas, the fuel of choice may be biogas, where you can combine sustainable livestock and regenerative agriculture with a biogas system that provides cooking fuel as well as, you know, fertilizer to enhance agricultural production. So it really is about thinking about the context and the needs of people and communities and providing a suite of solutions that people want and can afford. And this is where these types of models, the pay-as-you-go, ATMs, innovative consumer financing, so that we can build a market for clean cooking solutions and engage people in those value chains. This is not about taking away charcoal infrastructure, which so many people rely on, not just to cook their food, but for income generation as well. How do we transition a charcoal value chain into another form of sustainable energy value chain, whether that's biomass pellets, biogas, an ethanol supply chain, or being involved in an LPG distribution supply chain. LPG, whether we want to admit it or not, because of the fossil nature, is the fastest and most economic way to achieve access to clean cooking in many countries. And it is a climate and environmental win compared to the baseline of unsustainable biomass use. So if we are serious about climate goals, as well as health and environmental goals, we have to be willing to consider LPG where it is appropriate.
And Susan, would you like to react to that?
Very difficult to add to the brilliant points that have already been raised here. Without the risk of repeating myself, I think we really need to emphasize context-specific solutions. And also be aware that anything that sounds like a quick fix is probably not a very good and sustainable solution. So for instance, as we are working on the food security side, we get very worried with sources of biomass fuel or others that would perhaps then have a negative impact on food security. So for instance, if we want to produce clean cooking from, for instance, starch, you can produce from any starch. Innovations can produce from maize, from potatoes, any kind of starch can be used for producing. But then on the other hand, you have to think about the food security risk that could be associated with that. So it's very important, as I think you've already mentioned, that the most important thing is to look at what's the context, what are the options that are available, I am not an expert like yourselves on clean cooking. I'm more an expert on food security, land management side, and that's where it's good to create that balance. I'm also very much aware of unexploited potential on the biogas side, and especially where we have livestock, stall-fed livestock, and that could actually have a very big positive impact when we use that methane, not release it into the farms, and obvious ammonia as well that comes from the slough from livestock production. There's a huge potential there, but I think there has been a challenge in terms of setting up biogas in rural communities in Africa, which has been exactly the model that you've described, where a certain development partner comes, set up the production, the biogas production in a homestead without properly engaging with communities, with the women, with understanding how the system works, with discussing with them potential risk. And most of the time, once it's set up and the NGO goes, the women don't use it. It's, and we have a lot of those disconnects. It's a huge investment. So really having discussions and engagements with the users of these technologies, designing them in a way that they understand them, and really letting them know whether there are any kind of risks that they should be aware of, or it's just an attitude or lack of knowledge that may be leading to this kind of behavior, social behavior, sort of resistance patterns is extremely important. So just wanted to say absolutely spot on, contextually understanding what are the issues, co-designing these interventions and with the local and especially the end users, and ensuring that we are keeping in mind there could be some trade-offs when we look at some of the systems that could be providing the clean sources of energy.
And also, Susan, I'd love for you to break down for us, because I think it's not that obvious, the connection between clean cooking and food security. Could you actually break down why that impacts food insecurity?
Absolutely. First of all, it's a two-sided thing. As Sophie rightly mentioned, it's pointless to be able to produce food, to have food that then cannot be cooked in a clean way. So if there's no reliable sources of energy, then you can't have the end goal of achieving food security. So that's absolutely very clear. And in rural Africa, there are some places where now land has been so degraded that women spend hours going to look for firewood, and children as well. And this is time that could be used for other productive activities at the household level. So that's one connection, that you can't have a food security angle unless you have reliable, affordable, clean cooking sources. The other angle is to look at where is this coming from. So that's where I said a lot of it could come from starch, that can be used. I've seen ethanol that is being produced maybe from cassava, that is being produced from maize. And so I'm not saying that this is a bad source of energy, but in a context, in a continent where we have 200 million people every year suffering on average, that's an average. At a time like now when we've had drought, the number has been over 300 million people facing hunger and insecurity. And so it becomes very difficult to justify why we would be using, for instance, maize or cassava that can be used to feed people to produce the energy for cooking. So it's a two-sided coin. And so that's where we need to strike the balance. But I think KOKO Networks is very innovative, definitely very much aware of these dimensions. I use your two-burner cooking at home, and it's fabulous. And also they've actually cracked the model of access, which is another thing, that they really have ensured it's affordable, because for clean cooking adoption, it has to be affordable, it has to be accessible, and it has to have people have to have the right attitude towards it. Yeah. I didn't need a lot of convincing myself, because I can be able to access it very easily within the localities in Nairobi. I think we still need to have more infrastructure for countrywide access, but you're using mainly leftovers from sugarcane production and other kind of what would actually be food loss or food waste. And that's where we have huge potential. where we have food loss and food waste, materials that could end up being lost can be converted to usable products. So I'm just saying it's contextually relevant, specific, and I think there's opportunities to catalyze its transformation as long as we are aware of the balances that we need in the system.
Thank you. At this point, we have time for 1 or 2 audience questions, so I'll turn my attention to Meg.
The first one we have is actually coming from our online audience. Which food groups require the highest energy inputs during cooking, and can diets be modified to enable minimal energy use in energy-stressed areas?
I mean, again, it's a very sort of cultural, contextual question. I think there are a lot of staples, grains and beans and rice that naturally take a longer time to cook. But the question, yes, we can modify diets, but I think for the markets that we're serving and the people that daily are collecting wood and harvesting their own food, it's a little less about shifting their diet to match the minimal amount of energy that they have, and more to being able to provide a really minimum, I mean, we're talking basic amount of energy here. We need to get people off of this minimal amount of energy to cook 1 meal or 2 meals a day, whether that consists of beans or rice or anything that needs to be cooked for a long time. I think it's a slightly unfair question for this segment of the population to think about switching diets when so many people are, on a subsistence living, growing the food that they themselves are eating. Yes, there are ways to cook foods faster or cook different foods, but I think at this stage, talking about the connection of food and energy in terms of dietary intake is slightly off topic, but I think this is where these questions around how we link food security and energy security need to come together. And as Susan was saying before, it should be impossible to talk about food without cooking or cooking without food, but yet, as the world is grappling to come to terms with this unprecedented hunger crisis and look at solutions, cooking is very rarely seen as part of a sustainable food system, despite the fact that it affects nutrition on the consumption side, and it impacts land degradation and our ability to grow food in the first place. So we actually really need to bring these conversations together. And when we talk about sustainable agriculture, when we talk about shifting diets, we need to be realistic about the role that cooking and energy plays in all of those solutions so that we are actually addressing the challenges that people are having versus having a theoretical debate over sort of changing diets and how can we reduce energy consumption to cook. So I'll leave it at that.
And we'll try and take one last question.
For everyone, you are here at COP. What were you hope to see that could help to address the issues that you're working towards?
I think first I'll echo what Jillene said. The fact that clean cooking needs to be prioritized. It's starting to gain momentum. There has been a lot of focus when people talk about renewable energy. It's about electricity and lighting up homes, but forgetting again, you need to talk about both electricity, powering the homes, with clean cooking energy. So for me, it's critical to see clean cooking take its rightful place, but more importantly, for conversations about clean and renewable solutions take center stage. We need governments to step up and understand that without them being a partner to private sector players, there's no way we are going to be able to scale the solutions that we have. Radical as they are, we will not be able to scale them and be able to provide an alternative solution. I'm from Kenya. Our president has committed to planting 5 billion trees. I'm sure that's the same across a lot of African countries. But until we are able to provide the alternative, people will be planting trees, waiting a short period, and then they're cut down. So until we're able to do that side by side, it will be a loss. So it's critical that clean and renewable energy is front and center. Thank you.